Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to the Strong AF X Well Conditioned Show with your host, Jason Brown, where each week Jason teaches you how to get yourself and your clients brutally strong and, of course, well conditioned.
Welcome back to another episode of Strong AF X Well Conditioned. Today, we are talking about 3 ways that high-ticket coaches can drastically level up their clients' results. Now, there has been an influx of high-ticket coaches, and a lot of people are doing online training. A lot of them don't have a lot of experience before online training, which in my opinion is an issue, because when we don't have the in-person experience, it takes away from our ability to write an effective program and to see things that we might not necessarily see without that experience beforehand. So just a caveat to the show, there are things that I'm going to talk about today that can certainly help take your programs to the next level. But I do feel that having a level of experience before you go into the online space is needed, okay? And that's certainly a topic for another day. So one of the things that we've seen with this boom of online coaches is that they have a lot of the same issues that a brick and mortar gym would have. And one of those issues is retention. Now, there's been some studies that have predicted that the online space is going to grow exponentially in the next 5 years, but they still predicted that the same issue would be retention. Now, why are coaches having problems with retention? Well, there's a number of reasons. And one of the main reasons that we tend to see is that coaches aren't able to get their clients' results long-term. And one of the things that I think is the reason for this is that online coaches are putting people into programs that would otherwise be a mismatch for these people. So here's a scenario for you. You've had success using a body part split, and that's the split that you've used your whole life. You've been a coach for, say, 5 years, and you're now going into the online space. And up until this point, you used exclusively body part splits for yourself, as well as the few clients that you have worked with. So naturally, coaches that are more comfortable using a certain style of programming are probably going to use that style of programming with other people, albeit maybe it's not the right fit for those folks. So when this is the case and we're using our own biases to drive the programming process, there invariably is an issue. And that issue usually comes down to having a program that is not in alignment with the individuals you're working with. So oftentimes I talk about running into people on the street. Like if I was to run into 10 people on the street right now and I was to figure out, just based on something simplistic like their training availability, how many days a week can they devote to training? What would be the right training split for them? My hypothesis would be that if I ran into 10 people, the large majority, being 80 to 90% of them, would fall into the full body training split, where maybe they're only able to devote 3 days a week to their training, and a body part split just wouldn't check all the boxes that we needed to check as far as only being able to train 3 days per week. Now, if we go a step further and we look at just postures that we're in on a daily basis, or we look at things like stress levels, or we look at, where are people, where do they tend to be just characteristically weak, whether it be from conditioning or even just their overall strength levels, then full body would still check a lot of boxes, whereas a body part split would be very limited and just more rigid. So if we just boil it down to those things and the law of averages, full body will check more boxes for more people. Okay, so we know that to be true. And maybe you don't know that to be true. Maybe it's the first time you're hearing this. But if we know that we can check more boxes with a style of training, then it's going to make more sense for us to use that style of training. Now, the issue usually is that coaches don't know how to use that style of training. They don't have any framework. They don't have any education as far as how do I plug and play exercises? What are the right exercises? How do I vary it over time? And the list goes on. And oftentimes I hear things like, I don't know how to choose the right exercises. Something like a single leg pattern. We've got so many variations. Which one is the right variation? Or something as like conditioning. What type of conditioning do I use? Do I use aerobic conditioning? Do I use anaerobic conditioning? Intervals. What is the rest interval? What is the correct modality? Do kettlebells fit in? There's a whole list of questions that can pop up under both of these categories. And if we don't have any framework, it's hard to take all this information, especially stuff that we're seeing on social media, and try to distill that into a great training program. So 3 things today we're going to start with. Number 1 is a framework, having a system to write good programs. What is a system? A system is a way that you devise a training program where you reverse engineer from things like training availability, training age, training history, what are the client's goals, what are their limitations, what is their injury history, and then we reverse engineer. So if we just were to make this in the most simplistic program we could possibly make for the sake of just this podcast today, if someone came to me and they said, I can train 4 days per week, I'm probably not going to put them into a training split that is going to be optimal with a 5-day a week approach, like a body part split would tend to be. Now, there's, of course, caveats and variations to that you could certainly fit someone into. But again, if I'm thinking about law of averages, I'm probably going to go reverse engineer and use something like a full body split, or even a hybrid model where I maybe do an upper or lower and a full body session in conjunction with some conditioning. Because as we think about kind of just reverse engineering from training availability, we still need to plug in conditioning. And conditioning is one of those things that we're going to get to in our ways to level up your training programs for your clients that is often forgot about and not a lot of effort is put into it. People say, well, I'll just go for a walk or do 30 or 40 minutes of cardio. Okay. And that certainly leaves a lot of low-hanging fruit. So number one is having a system to plug in the right training methods for the right client at the right time. And when you have that framework, it's going to make it a lot easier to go through a process of figuring out what the right training split is for that client. Now, if you can imagine this, you have clients that are coming to you and you're using this process to put them into the right form of training. You can imagine you're probably going to keep these clients longer, right? Because they're now doing something that is more in alignment with their own individual needs, their own individual schedule. And then as we go even deeper to things like data points and different metrics that we could assess, we're going to have a better recipe for long-term success. Now, I see that the 90-day challenge, like people get results. It's great. They get into training, they get great results in 90 days, and people will be plastering those before and afters on social media, which is perfectly fine. But the question isn't what is going to get results for 90 days. The question is what's going to get results for the next 1, 2, 3 years. And having this process, you'll often iterate. So when you have this process, maybe you have a client that starts off and they can only train twice per week with you. And over time, they gain some more freedom where they can get in 3 times a week and 4 times and so on. And maybe their goals shift. Maybe as they get more advanced, they want to devote more time to developing a specific quality of fitness like maximal strength or power, or maybe they're going to train for an endurance event. All of these things become possible when you have a framework. Instead of just pulling things out of thin air and haphazardly plugging in things that may or may not be the right fit for that person, we have a framework that we can revert back to, take things out, and add things in, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. In my own programs, I use something called a 5-step process. And what that 5-step process is, I'm going to actually link some additional content in the show notes for this, is number one, figuring out what days a week they can train. What is the best scenario for their schedule? And oftentimes people will over-assess where they say, well, I can train 5 days a week. And I kind of frame it as, well, if you had like a gun to your head and you had to get these training sessions in, what would be the most that you could do? And usually some reevaluation takes place. They're like, ooh, you know what? Maybe it's only 3 days a week. So from there, we figure out what days is optimal. Now, whether it be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, so on and so forth, we use that as our first step to figuring out the optimal schedule. Now, it might seem simple, and it is, but this sets up success long-term because now we have a system that people can have higher levels of compliance with. And we know that people aren't going to get results if they're not able to comply with what you're giving. So this is number one. Number two, once we know those days, we can figure out what methods we're going to use. We're going to use some zone 2 conditioning. We're going to use some repeated effort method. We might even use some explosive strength work to prime their session, and so on and so forth. The list of methods is very long, and knowing where to put those things and plug those in is going to allow you to really program efficiently. Now, the method might just be doing 5 foundational movement patterns in each session. Maybe it's a squat, hinge, a lunge, a push, a pull, and that's their training for Monday. And then Wednesday, we have another variance of that. And then Friday, we have another variance of that. And then maybe we cycle in some zone 2 work to kind of bridge the gap between those sessions. Number 3 is now taking what we have here and adding in the exercise selection. What are the movements that we're going to choose for both our strength, our foundational strength work, as well as our conditioning work? And then as we kind of progress to step 4, we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. Sets, reps, and rest intervals. And again, rest intervals will span across both our strength work as well as our conditioning. And now step 5, this is really, really important step. It only takes place every 3rd week where we're going back to the client and asking for feedback. What's working well? What is not working well? Do you understand everything? How are you feeling? What is your levels of soreness like? All of those things are going to be pertinent for you to iterate and make improvements to your upcoming block of training. 5-step process, super important, something I teach to all coaches I work with. And it's a process that once you get familiar with it and comfortable, you can do this pretty quickly. And it doesn't take long at all. I write a 4-week block of programming in about 20 to 30 minutes. And then over time, with working with the same person, that will come down to around 15 to 20 minutes to write 4 weeks of programming. As I get to know them more, and of course, I have all of the information I need in place to really plug in the right program for that individual. So having this process is going to make your life easier, but it's also going to make your programs better and more sustainable, where your clients are able to now get results long-term. Step number 2, the second thing that you need to do to prioritize your clients' results long-term is to always be mindful of your foundational movement patterns. These are the variations that we use to develop our squat, our hinge, our lunge, our push, our pull, even our carry, and you can rope in some rotation work with that. This is the make or break for strength work, because a lot of times people are prioritizing variations that are just, maybe they're missing the boat. Maybe they're not able to do the variations that you plugged in. Maybe you're plugging in too many exercises in a session and it's just overwhelming for the client. Think about the perspective of the client as they go into that training session. If, let's just say you got 10 exercises in your session, that's potentially 10 demo videos that they're watching, training someone online. So it's a completely different perspective. So maybe it's narrowing down the exercise selection. And then as we get a little bit deeper, we think about more hierarchy. Where do we start with something like a single leg pattern? Do we just go right into rear foot elevated because we know that people will have, they're going to get sore from it. We know that. We also know that it's a great variation, but it is a great variation for everyone. And the list goes on. We can go through things like a deadlift. This is inherently a good movement, and it's something that we do in life, the foundational movement pattern. But is a conventional stance deadlift the right variation for someone that's just starting? Probably not. So knowing some hierarchy of movement patterns and how to program those patterns. Now, as we think kind of more about like more advanced, we can certainly plug in specific training methods, something like sub-maximal effort method for bilateral lifts, or dynamic effort training, some speed work that helps bridge the gap, helps spread out the way we're training. So we're not just lifting heavy all the time, we're also moving explosively and like an athlete. So there are a lot of different things. But if we just kind of like come back to center here and just really look at what are the true needs, it's getting stronger. It's getting stronger in the posterior chain. Specifically, we know that people are in these postures, these same postures on a daily basis, more internal rotation. We want to think about pulling them out of that with more posterior chain development from upper back complex, all the way down to hamstrings, and even doing some calf work. So a lot of low-hanging fruit there in the posterior chain. Now, plugging this stuff in with our first step, our 5-step process, is going to be relatively easy because we know what days they're training, we know what style of training they're using, we know what methods we're using, and now we just need to choose the right exercises. So if we think about just our squat, our hinge, our lunge, our push, our pull, our carry, that's going to be a good place to start with. But know that you don't have to go so far up on the movement pattern hierarchy to elicit change. You can start with a split squat. You can start with a dumbbell bench press with a neutral grip. You can start with something that might seem simple, but it's going to drive people in the right direction where they can build motor patterns, get some volume, and start seeing some changes, okay? So a lot of low-hanging fruit there, just developing strength, specifically where people are most weak, which if you spend time developing people's glutes, their upper back, their hamstrings, you're going to see a change in the way people feel, the way they're looking. Obviously, their strength levels will go up, but also we're going to add some lean tissue. So a lot of low-hanging fruit there as far as our strength work is concerned. Now, step 3, this might be the most important as far as qualities of fitness, is aerobic conditioning. Now, for years, people have said aerobic conditioning will make you slower, weaker, fatter. I was one of those people. I used to think the same thing. I was conditioned from that at a young age. Don't do any running. It's going to take, it's going to degrade fast twitch muscle fiber, and it's going to make you slower. And it's going to be, the thing that takes you further away from where you actually want to go, especially as an athlete. This couldn't be more untrue. And the reason is because for that to be the case, there has to be a severe deficit. There has to be just an inordinate amount of endurance work to bleed into, to interfere with strength and hypertrophy gains. And there's various studies out there on this. And it's funny, I actually had a conversation recently with Joe DeFranco, and years later, I looked at some of these studies, and it was funny that anecdotally we were kind of seeing that if we stayed in certain ranges for a certain duration of time with a certain level of frequency, we could still move the needle consistently with strength and power. And even now on Team CXC, we've got guys deadlifting 700 range, tons of guys in the 600 range, tons of guys in the 500 range. And I'm not here to toot my own horn about the results they're getting, but that's in conjunction with still doing aerobic conditioning on a weekly basis. It's a standalone modality. We do it on its own session, and we put a lot of emphasis on that. So it will not take away. And what the biggest thing here to consider is that weight training, even weight training like things like complexes, kettlebell complexes, or any type of CrossFit style, is different than aerobic training with cyclical measures. There's a blood pressure component that drives up vital metrics. It drives up the sympathetic response, and it has more of a constricting effect, whereas our cyclical work keeps blood pressure down. It allows us to have more, build more capillaries, have more surface area, and get more of a stretching effect of cardiac tissue. So very, very different things, okay? Getting your heart rate up is not the same as getting your heart rate up. That makes sense. If you have 140 from doing a kettlebell complex, 140 beats per minute, and then you do air bike for 20 minutes at 140, they are not the same thing. Vital metrics are not in the same position, and thus the air bike work is going to have a bigger effect on the aerobic system than the lifting, the complex work, okay? So know that they are not the same. Now, one thing I do is I mix some of that stuff in, because not only does it keep it more interesting, but it gives us a little bit more broad peripheral adaptations that we don't normally get from just doing cyclical work. So there is some benefits doing it. I'm not negating that there are benefits there, but knowing that the main thing here that I want you guys to take away is that conditioning needs the same level of attention, the attention to detail that your strength work does. So if you're going to town with your strength work, with all your sets, reps, and rest intervals, and your detail, and your RPEs, and your reps in reserve, and all that great exercise order, awesome. Do the same with your conditioning. Be concise with your conditioning. Make sure the RPE is there. Make sure, the rest intervals are there. Or if you're programming a higher intensity aerobic method, make sure that you're privy to what the correct rest intervals are and what the correct modalities are. Because if you just do movements that are really expending too much energy, like a global movement pattern, then you're going to spike the heart rate a lot more than you want to, and it's not going to be in the right range that we want it to be in. My advice would be learn as much as you can learn about conditioning. Make it a priority. If you're a great strength coach or you're a great hypertrophy coach, do the same with conditioning. Be a great conditioning coach. Learn energy systems, and learn it beyond just the basic textbook example of anaerobic and aerobic. Learn how to program rest intervals, learn how to target specific methods, and learn how that goes in to your program using that 5-step process. So that is it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, just to recap, we talked about 3 ways to level up client results. And that is, number 1, having a system of writing great programs. I use the 5-step process, which you can check out in the show notes. Number 2, prioritizing foundational strength development and not going too high on the movement pattern hierarchy. Harder variations don't necessarily mean better. And then number 3, putting the same attention to detail with your conditioning work as you do your strength work. See you guys on the next show.
This was another episode of Strong AF X Well Conditioned Show. Tune in every Wednesday for new episodes. And be sure to subscribe on all podcast platforms.